This week's portion is called Parshas Kisisa. Kisisa is the name of the portion, and we're already getting now towards the end of the book of Exodus. The weeks fly by so quickly. It's just amazing. I'm looking at the Chumash over here. We're halfway through the Chumash almost. Can you imagine that? Look at that, halfway through the Chumash. So Parsha Kisisa is very, very famous for the story of the Chet Egel, the sin of the golden calf. That's a big part of the portion, and we've spoken about that before. We'll speak about that in the future as well. But what I want to focus on today is the aftermath of the sin of the golden calf. And I'm going to review again the timeline, the sequence of events which led up to the golden calf and then the aftermath as well. So I'm going to share my screen, and I may have shown this to you before, but I actually modified it yesterday. And this is a timeline of the transmission of the Torah. That's the focus over here, the transmission of the Torah. So let me zoom in, drop. So I don't have the year dates over here, just the dates on the Jewish calendar. The 15th of Nisan was when the Jewish people came out of Mitzrayim, out of Egypt. And then 50 days later, can everyone see that? You can see it. I guess you can zoom in. You can see it. Okay, fine. So the 15th of Nisan was when the Jewish people came out of Egypt. And then 50 days later, on the 6th of Sivan, is the revelation at Sinai, where the Jewish people hear the Ten Commandments spoken by God. And again, this is when they heard the Ten Commandments, not receiving the Ten Commandments in the form of the tablets yet. This is just hearing the Ten Commandments. We learned about this a few weeks ago. Also, on the 6th of Sivan, Hashem teaches, from the 6th of Sivan for the next 40 days thereafter, in that period, Hashem teaches Moshe the entire Torah over 40 days. What's the entire Torah? The laws, the philosophy, the ethics, the mysticism, every aspect of Torah. Not just the legal parts of the Torah, but the mystical, the ethical, every aspect of Torah is taught to Moshe in the 40 days thereafter. After 40 days, he was supposed to come down with the tablets in his hands to give those tablets of the Ten Commandments to the Jewish people. But the tragic event of the sin of the golden calf took place on the 17th of Tammuz, which was 40 days later. And he sees that, and then the next day, on the 18th of Tammuz, Moshe descends the mountain and breaks the tablets in front of the Jewish people. Those tablets which were supposed to be given to the Jewish people with the Ten Commandments on them. The 19th of Tammuz, he goes back up to the mountain and he pleads for forgiveness. And he ensues in a 40-day period of asking and praying to Hashem for the forgiveness of the golden calf. And that took place for 40 days. He's praying to Hashem for forgiveness. Then on the 29th of Av, Hashem agrees to forgive the Jewish people, and Moshe descends to tell that to the Jewish people. They haven't been forgiven yet. I don't know exactly the details of this and why this is divided into two parts, where he first agrees to forgive the Jewish people, but he doesn't actually forgive the Jewish people until afterwards. I think probably because there is still a necessity for further tefillah, further prayer. Because on the first of Elul, the day after, Moshe goes back up to the mountain to learn Torah once again over the final 40 days when he's there. It's the second time he's learning the Torah again. These next 40 days correspond to the 40 days from Rosh Chodesh Elul leading up to Yom Kippur, which we commemorate in the years thereafter. And these days, the latter 40 days, are called days of Ratzon, days of desire, days of connection that Hashem has with us, because this is the period where God is forgiving the Jewish people. And then it's culminating on the day that he comes down, which corresponds to Yom Kippur, the 10th of Tishrei. Moshe then descends from the mountain a second time with the second tablets of reconciliation. And then the story then flows after that. We're not going to go through that right now, but just very briefly, 40 years later, over the next 40 years, Moshe teaches the Jewish people the Torah orally. He gradually writes down the 5 books of Moses, the completion of the Torah in the year 1272 BC, at the end of their journey through the desert, and then this is all much later, the writing of the oral tradition, and the writing of the Mishnah, the writing of the Gemara. That's not the subject of our discussion today. All right? Our portion, the end of Parshas Kisisa, zeroes in on the last 40 days. And then when Moshe comes down with the second tablets of reconciliation. So that's the very brief timeline. I can share that with you as well. I can send it to you in an email. So that is that's the timeline of what happened. So if you look in the actual portion, if you have the Chumash, page 515, chapter 34, verse 27, and it says that Hashem said to Moshe, write these words. And again, this is happening. This is taking place in the last 40 days. The last 40 days that he's up on the mountain, where the agreement to forgive the Jewish people has been expressed by Hashem to Moshe. And he's teaching Moshe the Torah once again, a second time through, all over again. And in that period, Hashem says to Moshe, write these words for yourself, for according to these words have I sealed a covenant with you in Israel. And there he remained for 40 days and 40 nights. And he doesn't eat bread, doesn't drink water. And he wrote on the tablets the words of the covenant, the Ten Commandments, because the second tablets are also being made in that last 40-day period. As a side, the difference between the first tablets and the second tablets is that the first tablets were made by God and written and inscribed on by Hashem. And the second tablets were made by Moshe, carved out by Moshe, but inscribed on by Hashem. That's the difference, and there's obviously a discussion about that as well. So he makes the second tablets, and then Hashem inscribes on the second tablets the Ten Commandments again. We spoke about the difference between the wording of the first tablets and the second tablets a few weeks ago. And then when Moshe descended from Mount Sinai with the two tablets of the testimony in the hand of Moshe, as he descended from the mountain, Moshe didn't know that the skin of his face had become radiant when Hashem spoke to him. So he comes down with a radiant glow on his face. And Moshe didn't realize, he wasn't even aware of it. You can't see your own face. You didn't have a mirror. But Aaron and all the children of Israel saw it. Behold, the skin of his face had become radiant. And they were afraid to approach him. So, that, by the way, this is the source for Michelangelo's famous picture or sculpture of Moses with the horns. You know, this whole ridiculous story about Jews having horns. It comes from this pasuk over here, because it says, I didn't say anything about horns over here, but the Hebrew, the text says, it says that Moshe Yoda ki karan or ponov bedabro ito. He didn't realize there was a karen or, the word karen, not my wife, karen, K-E-R-E-N. Karen means a horn. It also means like radiance as well. So the real translation is karan or ponov, that the skin of the face, like karan, like radiated out. And probably it's the same word as for radiance as for a horn, because a horn also has that impression of radiating outwards. So that's where that's where it was taken. So I guess some old translations translated as there was horns on his head. So that's how Jews became known to have horns, which is not true, obviously. But he had a radiant face. His skin was shining brilliantly with radiance, and people were afraid to approach him. So Moshe called to them, and Aaron and all the leaders of the assembly returned to him, and Moshe would speak to them. After that, all the children of Israel would approach him. He would command them regarding everything that Hashem had spoken to him on Mount Sinai. So these two verses over here describe how Moshe taught Torah to the Jewish people. And then it says Moshe finished speaking with them. Whenever he's finished speaking with them, he would then place a mask on his face to cover the radiance which was so frightening to the people. So he had this radiance which stayed with him all the time. But it caused fear in the hearts of the people when they saw this intense radiance coming from his face. So he placed a mask on his face. He took it off, though, whenever he taught Torah to the Jewish people. When Moshe would come before Hashem to speak with him, he would take his mask off until his departure. So when he was learning from Hashem, certainly he didn't have the mask on his face. And then he would leave and tell the children of Israel whatever he'd been commanded, still with the mask off of his face. And then the final verse, when the children of Israel saw Moshe's face had become radiant. He then put the mask back on until he came to speak with Hashem. So he's constantly, throughout their experience with him, throughout their experience in the desert, Moshe is taking his mask off, putting his mask on. When I was gonna send this class out in the email afterwards, I was gonna give the title "The Jewish View on Masks," but I think it would be too misleading, and that, because everyone would want to listen to it, and then they'd realize I'm not talking about masks as we know it, as everyone knows it today, but it's this kind of mask over here. But this was the experience that they had of Moshe, that he had this mask on his face, covering this radiance. And then whenever he was learning Torah from Hashem, or whenever he was teaching Torah to the Jewish people, he would take his mask off. So that's the end of the passage of it. This is the last aliyah of the parsha. So the question begs itself: like, what is this? What is the nature of this light, this radiance, and why is it so important for us to hear it? So, and where did it come from? How did he have this light on his face? So there's a very interesting medrash. The Medrash says that there's actually a machlokas, a three-way dispute as to what is the origin, what was the source of this light, this radiance which was on Moshe's face. So the first opinion says, the Medrash says, Mehechad natal Moshe karnei hahod. Where did he get this light from? Where was the radiance from? So the first opinion is the Rabbanan, the sages, and they said min ha'ara, from the cave. The cave is a reference to a pasuk earlier in the portion, right, earlier chapter 33, verse 22. Earlier on, 33:22, it says that when Moshe was in the first 40 days, the middle 40 days. The first 40 days was when he went up to receive the tablets in the first place, the Ten Commandments in the first place, right, to receive the tablets in the first place. Then the second 40 days is post the sin of the golden calf, and in that period, that's when he's praying for their forgiveness. And in that second period, the verse says that he was in a cave. It says that when my glory, he said that. I'm sorry. Hashem said, you're not going to be able to see my face. Hashem said to Moshe, for no human can see my face. And Hashem said, behold, there's a place near me. You may stand on the rock, and when my glory passes by, I shall place you in a cleft of the rock. So Hashem put Moshe into a cleft in the rock, like a cave inside the rock, and I'm going to shield you with my hand until I've passed over you. It's very mysterious what's going on here, but he was put inside a cleft, a cave inside the rock, and Hashem passed over him. So that was then. So the Medrash says that the origin of the radiance on his face was when the Shekhinah, the divine presence, passed over him at that point. That's one opinion. That's the Rabbanan. Then the Medrash says, Reb Rechia HaKohen, Reb Rechia the Kohen, said in the name of Rabbi Shmuel that the origin of his radiance was the following. It was from the luchos themselves, the tablets. So listen to this. It says the tablets were 6 handbreadths high, 6 handbreadths wide, and they were cubes. There were 2 cubes of 6 handbreadths, and the Medrash says that of these 6 handbreadths, Moshe held on to 2 handbreadths of the tablets. Hashem held on to 2 handbreadths of the tablets, so they were both holding on to 2 ends of the tablets. I guess, one in each hand, but let's just take one. So Moshe was holding on to 2 handbreadths of a tablet, and Hashem was holding on to the other 2 handbreadths of the tablet. So 2 and 2 make 4, but the Medrash said there were 6 handbreadths wide. So there were 2 handbreadths which weren't being held by either of them. There were 2 handbreadths in the middle. Moshe was holding on to 2, the divine presence onto 2, and 2 handbreadths were in the middle. Umisham natal Moshe karnei hahod. It was from those 2 middle handbreadths of the tablets that neither Moshe nor Hashem were holding on to. Those 2 handbreadths produced radiance on Moshe's face. Go figure. What is that? What does that mean? I'll come back to it in a second. I'll explain each one of them. The third opinion is Rabbi Yehuda Bar Nachman in the name of Reish Lakish, and he says no. The origin of the radiance on Moshe's face was the following: Ad Shahaya Koseh B'Kulmus, when Moshe was writing the Sefer Torah, because He was very busy on the mountain for all these days. He wasn't eating, wasn't drinking. He was learning all day. He was listening to Hashem. He was also writing a Sefer Torah as well. So while he was writing the Sefer Torah, the kulmus with the ink which he had, nishtaya kima, there was a little bit of ink which was left inside the quill, or it didn't quite go onto the parchment. There was a tiny drop of ink which didn't go onto the parchment. V'havir al rosha, and he passed it over his head. Either Hashem passed it over his head, or Moshe. While Moshe was writing with the quill, a bit of ink remained on the quill, and he passed the quill through the hair of his head. So it looks like it was Moshe did that himself. He passed the quill through the hair on his head. And from that ink, the radiance of light came from, and then settled upon his face. That's where it came. It says Moshe Yoda ki karna upon him. He didn't realize he had this radiance on his face because he didn't realize some of the ink dropped onto his head and it created the radiance on his face. So there you have it. Now you understand. Now it all makes sense, right? So either the radiance came from when the divine presence passed over him in the cleft in the rock, either it came from the middle two handbreadths of the tablets of stone, or it came from the ink over here. Fine, so that makes a lot of sense. Obviously, we have to understand this. It's mystical and it needs understanding. So that's why I have all these books over here, because I can look at all these commentaries and figure out what's going on, because it's so mysterious. So going to the second explanation, the tablets, the middle two tefachim, the middle two handbreadths. So some of the commentaries over here, they explain based upon a profound idea that Torah is divided into three areas. There are three areas of Torah. Now, not the Torah which we're learning, which we study, but Torah in the cosmic realm of existence, the cosmic realms. Torah has three levels to it. The highest level of Torah is the essence, the very essence of Torah, which is within Hashem, so to speak. And these are ideas which are hard to really put our words to it, but we can just try and grasp the ideas a little bit. But the highest level of Torah is the essence of Torah, which is completely in the realm of God, so to speak. It's the essence of Hashem, it's the essence of His will, which a human being has no grasp of. When I say Torah, I'm not talking about the book of the Torah, I'm talking about the will of Hashem, the words of Hashem, the expression of Hashem. The will of Hashem. So what is the will of Hashem? The deepest will of Hashem is inaccessible to a human being. A human being cannot grasp and tap into the deepest will of Hashem. So therefore, the deepest level of Torah is an aspect, a dimension of Torah which is completely in the realm of Hashem. That's represented by Hashem holding on to the tablets over here. So his grasp on the tablets at his end represents the dimension of Torah which is completely beyond the grasp and comprehension of any human being whatsoever. The other end of Torah, the aspect of Torah which is completely comprehensible and accessible to human beings, is what we're learning, all the Torah which we're learning, and it's represented and symbolized by the fact that Moshe is holding on to the other end of the tablets. When he's holding on to his piece of the tablets which he's holding on to, symbolizes the aspect of Torah which is completely accessible to human beings. But then there's a dimension of the Torah which is in between, which is very profound, which is very beyond, but not completely beyond and inaccessible, but it's also not completely comprehensible to the masses. And that's the middle portion of Torah, the middle portion of the tablets. That middle segment of the tablets, that two handbreadths in the middle, symbolizes a dimension of the depth of Torah, which is really esoteric and really out there, and is really incomprehensible to most people, but to the people of the likes of Moshe, he can understand it, and the way it manifests itself, not through words, not through actions, not through any particular articulation, it emanates through radiance. It just comes out through the radiance on his face, because he's absorbed that deeper dimension of God's will into his being, and therefore it comes out. It just radiates out of his face, not in a tangible word articulated fashion, but in his emanation, the light which comes from his face, so the radiance in his face comes from that higher level of Torah, inaccessible to the regular person, accessible only to Moshe, and therefore he radiates, and that's where the light comes from. That's the second explanation as to where the radiance came from. The last explanation was from the drop of ink. So this, the Orach Chaim, another commentary, the Orach Chaim is a commentary on the Chumash. He suggests the following. He says that that Moshe, there's a pasuk about Moshe in Bamidbar in Numbers chapter 12 verse 3, very famous verse. Moshe, the Torah says that where is it over here? Can't see the verse. He was honored of Mikol Adam. He was the humblest of all people. So the humblest of all people is Moshe. Humblest of all people. That's a verse in Numbers. So when you look at that word, when you look at the word anav, which means humble, you'll notice that it's spelt without a yud. The word anav is typically spelled as an ayin, a nun, a yud, and a vav. And over there in that verse where it says that he was the humblest of all people, it's spelt without a yud. So the Orach Chaim explains, he says, the reason why it's spelled without the yud, that was because of Moshe's own humility. Can you imagine if you're Moshe? If you're Moshe and you have to now, you're being dictated the Torah, and Hashem tells you, write down about yourself that you're the humblest of all people. How'd you do that? I've got to write down like I'm the greatest guy. I mean, I'm the humble. It's just so antithetical to his desire to want to be humble. So how does Moshe write down the word in the Torah? I am the humblest of all people. So what he did to circumvent or to downplay his that arrogance, not arrogance, but the feeling, was he deliberately didn't put the yud inside the word anav. So he wrote the word anav, humblest, without it still spells humble, but he didn't want to write the yud. He wanted to downplay himself. He wanted to be humble in writing down the fact that he's a humble man. And therefore he omitted the yud from the word anav, from the word humble. He takes the letter yud out of it. Now you can't do that type of thing. You can't just take letters out. We don't allow that. But Hashem knew that he was going to do this. When he was writing the Sefer Torah, he knew Moshe wanted to do this. Hashem knows that he wants to do this, but letters can't be taken out. So what does Hashem do? Hashem takes that letter of Moshe's humility, the letter yud of Moshe's humility, a tiny little drop of yud is a tiny drop of ink. It's the smallest drop of ink for writing a letter in the Sefer Torah. So Hashem takes the tiny yud, the drop of ink, and instead of applying it and insisting on him having him write that yud inside the word anav, humble, he takes that yud and he transforms it into the radiance on his face, depicting the humility, his own humility in not writing that yud transfers and becomes the radiance on his face. That's the reward he's given. So the conservation of the letters is maintained, but Moshe's wish is upheld and Hashem's desire is upheld. So therefore, the little yud turns into the radiance on his face, and that's how the Orach Chaim explains the source of the radiance in that example. The question is, though, again, what's the message of all of this? What is the Medrash trying to teach us with all of this, and what are these things what's going on with these different examples? So the truth is if you look at the whole passage, the whole of the last Aliyah. Let me just give me a second to just make sure. 1 second. Just see one more thing over here. Yeah. Okay, fine. I'll do that afterwards. So if you look at the whole picture of the whole last Aliyah, there is a common thread going on over here in the thing which I read before, because if we go back to the beginning of the passage says that Hashem said to Moshe, "Write these words for yourself, for according to these words I've sealed a covenant with you." The covenant. Right, the agreement, the treaty between the Jewish people and Hashem. The Torah is the treaty. The Torah is the contract. The Gemara, though, says, I don't want to get caught up in all the nuances and the details over here, but the actual words of the Hebrew words over here, when it says, write for yourselves these words, because according to these words, I'm making a treaty with you. The Hebrew actually says, ki al pia devarim, literally means according to, on the mouth of these words, literally on the mouth of these words. So the Gemara says that based upon that phraseology, the Gemara says that the real basis of the treaty and the contract and the covenant between the Jewish people and Hashem is not really just simply about the written words of the Sefer Torah, but it's specifically on the mouthed parts of the Sefer Torah. What are the mouthed parts of the Sefer Torah? The oral tradition. We know that Torah is made up of the written word and the oral word. So when the verse says over here, Hashem says to Moshe, I'm making a covenant with you, I'm making an agreement with you, we're making a pact, we're making a covenant with each other. The basis and the contract and the terms of the foundation of the entire contract is the oral tradition. The oral tradition. Not just the written law, but the oral tradition. You can't look at Torah only as the written law, it's the oral law as well. And if anything, the oral tradition, that which I'm transmitting orally, is the most significant part of the Torah, and it's on that the covenant is being sealed between me and you. The oral tradition. And this, is a discussion into itself, the difference between the oral and the written law. But one difference, the Maharal says, is that the written law, the 5 books of Moses, is a book. It's a scroll which you could put on the shelf, you could put in the closet, and you could distance yourself from it. You don't need to be connected to it. The difference between that and the oral tradition is profound. The oral tradition is inside of you. It's not on the shelf, it's inside of you. Because if Torah is primarily taught through oral transmission, teaching verbally, listening with your ears, it's much more part of you. The written Torah is on a book, it's in a book, it's on a scroll, it can go on the shelf. It's more disconnected. So therefore, when Hashem is making the covenant with the Jewish people, the bond is being established with the Jewish people, he says, I want the bond has to take place via the vehicle of oral Torah, of the oral tradition, because that will be part of you. I'll be part of you. My word will be a part of you. It won't just be on a shelf, on a bookshelf. On a bookshelf. So I remember going somewhere. I remember years ago, I was in someone's house and I was looking at. They had a beautiful library of old books, and I was just thinking. I said, "Have you read these books?" No. Like I always have books I haven't read, but the tendency, books look impressive on the shelf. But how many people read their books on this? They sit there, but you don't have any access to it. An oral tradition, you're connected to it. So that's number one. That's the first part of the passage over here, that he's saying that the oral tradition is the foundation of the connection. And then furthermore, it then says in verse 31 and 32 that when Moshe came down from the mountain, he came down from the mountain and Moshe called the people. He called everyone together. He called Aaron and the leaders, and he began teaching them the Torah. So there's a very, again, famous description in the Gemara about how Moshe taught the Torah to the Jewish people. How he taught the Torah to the Jewish people. And there was a very organized, systematic process. I'll just read to you what it says. It says, the order of how it was taught, how the Torah was taught to the Jewish people, was that Moshe would go into his tent, Aaron would come into him first, and then Moshe would tell him the text of the mitzvah, or the mitzvah he had received one time, and would teach him its explanation. And then Aaron would then withdraw and move to the right of Moshe Rabbeinu. His sons Elazar and Isamar would then enter, and Moshe would tell them everything he had told Aaron. They would then withdraw, with one of them moving to Moshe's left side, and the other to Aaron's right side. Then the 70 elders would enter, and Moshe would teach them as he had taught Aaron and his sons. Then the masses of the people would enter, all who sought Hashem, and Moshe would place the mitzvah before them as well, so they would all hear it from him. It emerges that Aaron heard the mitzvah from Moshe 4 times, his sons heard it from him 3 times, the elders twice, and the rest of the people once. Moshe would then withdraw, and Aaron would teach the text of the mitzvah and explain it, as he'd heard it 4 times from Moshe, as we said, and then Aaron would then withdraw. Thus his sons heard the mitzvah 4 times, 3 from Moshe and once from Aaron. And then after Aaron would withdraw, his sons Elazar and Isamar would then teach the mitzvah to all who are present. and then withdraw from teaching. So the 70 elders would hear the mitzvah taught 4 times, twice from Moshe, once from Aaron, once from Elazar in the summer. Then the 70 elders would teach the text of the mitzvah 1 time to the masses. Thus the entire congregation would hear the mitzvah 4 times, once from Moshe, once from Aaron, a 3rd time from Aaron's sons, and a 4th time from the mouth of the elders. The people would then disperse to teach one another what they'd heard from Moshe, and they would write the mitzvah in scrolls. So it's describing that. So this is the process of the oral transmission of the Torah. Torah is transmitted orally. You have to have a living connection. It has to be given in an oral. It's not through a textbook. And it was done in this very organized fashion, a very thorough fashion of making sure that everyone would hear the mitzvah over and over and over again. And then it goes on to say that as the Jewish people traveled through the desert, what were they doing all the time? They were just constantly learning and repeating, reviewing it, discussing it, comparing and contrasting. It was a constant process of yeshiva. It was a yeshiva for 40 years there. I mean, they didn't realize they were going to be in the desert for 40 years, but it was a yeshiva of constant discussion and dialogue in the Torah. So the last passage of it, or last aliyah over here, is highlighting the whole method of transmission of the oral tradition, of how Torah was given over to the Jewish people. Number 1, it has to be done orally. And the covenant is cut and made over the oral tradition because information which is transmitted orally is part of you. It's not on the shelf. It's not a book in a book on the shelf. It's inside your heart. And then the process of teaching it is a constant reviewing it, teaching it to this person. Then he hears it. He has to review it. He has to compare it to the next person, make sure he's got it right. Constant dialogue back and forth. And, one of the things which gets my goat, when people, marshal this claim, well, isn't Judaism like, the oral tradition is whispered down the lane when you kind of pass down information down a whole, line of transmission, it gets distorted along the way. It's such a silly, way of looking at it because, yes, of course, if I say something to one person and that person doesn't check with me to make sure he got it right, and then he passes on to the next person, and then there's no cross-references in checking, and it's only one line of transmission, you're 100% right, you're going to get distortions down the line. But if you have thousands of change of transmission, and every step along the way, it's constant reviewing and constant comparing and contrasting and checking with the other person, making sure you learned it correctly from your teacher, making sure with your colleagues that you got it right. And so there's multiple change of transmission. It's a never-ending process of verification to make sure the information is correct. So aside from the information being accurate, being more accurate than having it in a textbook, but it also, again, creates that living connection. The living connection is it's not in a textbook. It's in my heart. Torah is in my heart. It's in my emotions. It's in my soul. So that's what the passage is speaking about. So then if we go back to the description of Moshe's radiance, it makes a lot of sense. It fits into this whole theme over here. Because another dimension of the transmission of Torah is that the people who are teaching Torah have to have it really glowing inside their hearts and glowing on their faces. Torah needs to be glowing. Torah needs to be alive. Torah needs to be radiant. And the greatest example of that was Moshe. Hashem wanted Moshe to have this radiant face, this radiance coming from him, because that would penetrate the hearts of the Jewish people when he's teaching them. And it really, we don't have this type of radiance today. I mean, there's no one has the kind of radiance that Moshe had. But a semblance of radiance we do find. I have to tell you something. When I reflect back upon my years in yeshiva, and my Rosh Yeshiva, the Rav Aaron Schechter, I've shown you this picture before, right? That's the picture of my Rosh Yeshiva, right? So the memories I have of sitting in a shir and listening to the, not even many times not even understanding what he was saying, and this is really very interesting. Not understanding the actual shir itself, but sitting there, but gaining so much and appreciating so much by being in his presence. Because I don't know, you can't put a finger on it. It's just there was an energy, there was a light, there was a spirituality, there's a radiance which just penetrates the heart. And that is the key. It's like it's such a fundamental dimension of the transmission of the Torah. I want to read to you. I've got this another commentary over here. This is a beautiful commentary over here describing, that type of transmission, the type of transmission when it's like that. The inner light of Torah is not communicated through words. When a great sage transmits his Torah teachings to his disciples, the sentences he speaks are only an outer manifestation of the Torah he imparts. They represent the concrete and unchanging base of Torah knowledge, but they give no access to the essence, to the sublime substance of the Torah itself, given sanctuary and expression in a refined and elevated soul. The soul of the Torah makes its way from sage to disciple not through any rational process, but through a joining of souls. The entire being of the sage is suffused with the Torah that surges in his heart. Being of the sage, with the sacred feeling that stirs his soul. His deep and holy wisdom is implicit in the tilt of his head. It announces itself in his every gesture and expression. It shines from the lines of his face. As the verse states in Ecclesiastes, Chochmas Odin Toy Ponav, a man's wisdom illuminates his face. The devoted disciple hears the words of the sage and gazes upon his luminous visage. His heart opens to that of his teacher, and along the immaterial strands that bind and flows the essential wisdom, the soul of the Torah. Isn't that beautiful? It's a beautiful. That's what is being conveyed by Moshe. Moshe is the sage par excellence, with the radiance of Torah in his soul imparted upon the Jewish people. They needed that, and we need this. We need this. This is an essential ingredient. So what really emerges also so one more thing, with that radiance, the radiance of his face, I was thinking to myself that the Medrash, which I was reading, the three sources of the radiance, I said, if you remember, either the radiance came from the tablets, or the radiance came from the drop of ink, or the radiance came from the touch of the divine presence upon him when he was in the cave. So when we really put those three pieces together, the radiance of Moshe was so vast and so profound. It had three dimensions to it. He had the radiance as a result of the Torah, as is represented by the two handbreadths of the tablets, which has the higher depths and the mystical dimensions of Torah. So he had the radiance of the depths of Torah. He also had the radiance of the touch of the divine presence from when he was in the cave, right? He had that, and he also had the radiance of humility. So he was really completely, a complete embodiment of the ultimate of radiance of Hashem, and served as the perfect model, the perfect precipitator of the Torah for the Jewish people, to be the perfect transmitter. And it was such a brilliant radiance that they were scared to see it, but they needed it, and they had to experience it when they were learning Torah. And that penetrating impact of his soul upon the Jewish people was enough. It was enough to be able to propagate the Jewish people for thousands of years into the future. But now, even again, we don't have any human being like that ever again. But every sage of Israel has, or should strive for having a little bit of that. And even the students, us as students of the sages, the leaders of Israel. I mean, this is, when I talk about Gedolei Yisrael, Gedolim, that one of the greatest things we should have in our lives is a connection to Gedolei Yisrael, what we call Gedolei Yisrael, great sages of the Jewish people, the leaders, the eyes of the people. What makes them eyes, what makes the Gedolim, the great sages of Israel, is sages. Aside from the learning they had, aside from the academic knowledge, that's just a tiny piece of it. But they've absorbed the Torah into the very heart and soul of their being. They're humble people. And they're touched by Hashem. They're connected to Hashem. They're touched by the Torah. They are imbued with the wisdom of Torah, and they have humility. That's what makes them Gedolim. So even though you can't see the physical radiance from the face in such a overt way like we saw with Moshe, but they have it too. So it's important, as teachers, but I would say more as students, to attach ourselves to those sages who have that radiance, because that's what's going to guarantee the transmission of the Torah. So this passage over here is the aftermath of the golden calf. When they fell very, very big time with the golden calf. And this is now the reconciliation, the restoration of the relationship. But as part of that restoration of the relationship, Torah has to be established so deeply in the hearts of the people henceforth. And the way that that's done is by a living, vibrant, radiant transmission of Torah, not just through an academic, theoretical, and that's a nice kind of idea approach to learning Torah, where it's just in a book on a shelf, but it's living and pounding inside of our hearts and souls. And that's what this is all about. And it's a perfect ending of this passage, the perfect ending of the whole story of the golden calf. And it's interesting because it seems to be no indication that Moshe had that radiance, or was going to have that radiance, or had that radiance before this episode. In other words, this radiance is now in the aftermath of the golden calf. So it's really a very inspiring idea that they fell so far, they went down so far, they sinned with the golden calf, and despite that, they were deserving of having Moshe as having this radiance on their face. Maybe that's because they needed that much more, perhaps. But whatever, the point is that this is it's a living Torah. It's not a static academic Torah. It's a living, vibrant, spiritual Torah. That's what it's about. And that's what's going to keep it alive inside all of us. So may we merit to always be connected to the living spirit of Torah, to be able to, to radiate the Torah out of ourselves, to be connected to radiant leaders, and may that be to be able to usher in the coming of the Mashiach very quickly.